Welcome back to the news where today we've got to work out if your hopes and dreams will actually come true. Seems a bit grand, but no, today it is about the Microsoft acquisition. Basically, a lot of headlines have been going around the internet the last while talking about potential really good things. And it's because Phil Spencer said some stuff, some of which is actually really good, some of which is also seemingly being taken wildly out of context. And I fear that might just lead people in not really the right direction. So here's the deal. After the deal went through, Phil was interviewed. He was interviewed by the extremely hard-hitting publication, the official Xbox podcast, and in that he basically talked about a bunch of things, and ultimately what this is a bunch of Microsoft employees talking to each other about what Microsoft are going to be doing in the future. It's around 20 minutes of conversation about what they're doing generally and specifically with Activision-Blizzard King, and for a lot of us this is a rather hot topic because it very much looks like Bobby Kotick will be leaving at the end of 2023. That's a very big change, and perhaps that change could open the doors to some things being pretty damn good, or at least a little bit better. One of the videos that actually kicked this off, and of course there's been a lot of scrutiny over Phil Spencer's words because a lot of people really want to like these IPs. Look at Warcraft and the role that has played in people's lives for the last 20 years. Same goes for Diablo. More recently, Overwatch, right? Which, until they completely fumbled that bag, was actually quite beloved around the world. So while this Stylosa video is just like one example over on YouTube, there is loads. And I mean, come on, I'm basically the Warcraft version of Stylosa. I absolutely have a horse in this race. And yeah, if I had good things to say, I absolutely would be trying to say them. But let's actually dive into what's going on here and what Phil Spencer's words are. While things may not be as good as we may want, there are actually a few glimmers that we can talk about. So first up, Phil commented on the regulatory process holding things up with the deal, which basically has changed all their plans. He said, it felt like the game, or the goal itself, was to get through the regulatory process. That's just the beginning. I mean, as an example, in the trailer that they released for this merger, and yes, the idea of a trailer for a merger is a strange thing. Phil Spencer actually seems to be quite self-aware about that, but the Call of Duty logo is actually an old Call of Duty logo, which does point to this likely being ready to go for some while. So what's actually happening is Phil Spencer has been going around the world visiting the various different offices of the studios that they have acquired. The likes of course, King and Stockholm, and then Activision and Blizzard's various offices. And per Phil, this trip is basically getting with the teams and working out what they're going to do together, essentially looking at what games are in development, where they're at overall, and where things are in terms of a future roadmap. Ultimately, though, the biggest takeaway for audiences right now is probably what Phil had to say in this podcast about Game Pass and Activision-Blizzard. So, basically, there's nothing concretely lined up. With Activision-Blizzard King, the regulatory process took so long, and frankly, there was a lot of uncertainty on that process up until really a week before we closed, or even the week of, that the CMA came down to their decision that we weren't able to get in and work with, mostly Activision-Blizzard in that case, on that back catalog. So now the deal is closed, we're starting that work, but there is work. So basically that means that he's saying that 2024 is a more accurate timeline for the first Game Pass titles to come, but he did say that there are no Bethesda-style secret drop of backlog games coming this year. Essentially, right, they've not really been able to work with Activision Blizzard King decently closely because of all of those regulatory concerns. Now, when the games do come, though, he gave some confirmation that Call of Duty, especially on PlayStation and Nintendo, will have complete parity with what's going on the Xbox, at least in every way they can control. Obviously, you're not getting 60 FPS on a Nintendo Switch. Basically, the point is they're not going to use Call of Duty to sell Xboxes by doing, say, a unique early access beta or that kind of thing. Now, then there was some talk about how Spencer believes teams, IPs, and franchises could be used, and this is where we essentially get to a lot of the misunderstandings that led to loads and loads of headlines out there. And the reason why I'm really diving into this is because for so many of us, when like your informational landscape is just so goddamn full of stuff every second, yeah, you can easily skim a few headlines and just sort of take away, yeah, roughly it's going in that direction. This is where you really should know the details of what he said. Quote, "I don't think a team is working on something that isn't their passion leads to the best results." All right, Phil, fair enough. We can agree with that. "I want to make sure when we're going back and visiting something that we do it with our complete ability. A motivated team that wants to go back and work on something and make a difference, not just create something for financial gain or create something for a PR announcement and not deliver on the product." Now, this is the quote that actually directly inspired today's video existing, because quite a few have essentially divorced one clause in here from the rest of its context. And that clause is not just create something for financial gain or create something for a PR announcement. Now, that is a loaded ass statement in its own, and if you think about Activision-Blizzard in particular, it really does sound amazing, right? This means that monetization takes a backseat to the gameplay. It means not just hoping for good headlines, it means actually delivering on them. You could perhaps say it means that bad news will not be regularly scheduled to happen, say, half an hour after the Overwatch team has a major announcement. Have you noticed that lately? There'll be like bad news and it would just always so happen to time right after a game team did something large. I've got to imagine, like, the game teams would always say, we don't coordinate this at all. I would imagine the game teams have no idea about the bad announcements, but, at the more corporate level, they know when all their announcement beats are coming out, and I imagine that the corporate level, they just decide if there is something bad, then they could just slip it in afterwards and not really tell anyone. This statement taken, isolated, right, without any of the other context of what Phil actually said, you could say this is the ideal situation that someone could have from this merger, that essentially we're getting the good things of Activision-Blizzard, which is some of the development that goes on, the IP, the history and all of that, but we're not going to get the bad stuff, which, Bobby and co going around ruining everything. But the thing is, Phil Spencer was not talking about Overwatch, he wasn't talking about Diablo, Call of Duty, or Warcraft as they exist right now. He wasn't talking about teams being able to strip out their battle passes. He wasn't talking about PR for current games. What Phil Spencer was actually talking about in this podcast was legacy IP, Zork, Guitar Hero, Lost Vikings, and making sure that when things like that are relaunched, that they are done so in a way that feels loving and meaningful. So yes, Phil did say some really good things. However, we do have to take them in their full context, which was that it's about legacy content. That being said, there is a lot of legacy content that actually, especially thinking about Blizzard Entertainment, we're pretty darn interested in. Hell, the same even goes for Activision. As an example, earlier this year, there was the story of the matchmaking servers or whatever being fixed for the older Call of Duty games on Xbox. And that actually led to people just playing COD 4, playing Modern Warfare 2 in pretty damn significant numbers, to the point where those games are actually surging up charts on the Xbox platform, which was pretty incredible. Now, there's an amazing comparison, and that is between Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition and, of course, Warcraft 3 Reforged. It's actually even more worth bringing up AoE 2 Definitive Edition, because they've actually recently had an update. It's brought in a whole bunch of civs. The whole mule cart mechanic, which is a new mechanic to the game. I regularly check in with a YouTuber called Spirit of the Law for all of my Age of Empires 2 goodness. Game I, of course, played way back in the day as a kid. Point there essentially is they absolutely knocked that one out of the park with Age of Empires 2 Definitive. Indeed, they didn't even have to do that good of a job, right? They didn't even have to do as complete a job as they did, because they've actually done Age of Empires 3 and 1 Definitive, even though I would kind of argue that 2 was really the one that most people cared about. They actually did a pretty damn full-featured job to actually show the whole franchise some love. And yes, of course, Age of Empires 4 was also coming out, but they've been pretty sure to say, like, look, Age of Empires 4, it's taking a lot from AoE 2, but they are separate games, and actually letting them live there. It's really awesome, and of course, they haven't done any scummy things like essentially delete the old version of the game or anything like that. From what I've been led to believe in War 3 Reforged, like, people at the company did want to do that, but they had bad leadership, and they essentially did not get the resources that they needed. It was announced too early because they basically wanted to announce more stuff, and of course, as you know, the pre-orders for that came in way too early compared to the game itself. Of course, those pre-orders were done along with a tie-in to World of of Warcraft, where you could get, some mounts in-game if you pre-ordered. It overall was a very scummy situation, so comparing these titles is an absolute night and day difference. Now, for Warcraft 3 Reforged, it's a very, very interesting situation. I'm not going to get fully into the details here, but they were essentially pitching a full kind of like remake of the campaign, where maps would be updated, some performances, camera, all of that. They would even be adding and tweaking some things so that it properly fits with the modern canon. Essentially, a bigger, higher budget feeling, more sort of cinematic experience. And per leaks, a lot of the work had actually been done on that. However, they ended up cutting that way back. They claimed it was in light of community feedback, which I don't really think anybody buys, and obviously when the game came out, it was an absolute disaster. So, in terms of legacy content then, we have a clear track record of Blizzard really messing it up with Warcraft 3 Reforged. We have a track record of Microsoft actually doing a pretty damn good job. But again, these things that Phil said about releasing things for the sake of PR, just for the monetization, those only apply to legacy IP. Let's talk a little bit more broadly then about more sort of newer, bigger budget games, right? What's actually going on with those? So broadly speaking, Microsoft do not seem to have interfered much with ongoing projects that they have acquired. As an example, Fallout 76 still has its Fallout First feature, which is its premium, live service pass monetization. Elder Scrolls Online, that has just been left to its own devices. And even in their own teams, Halo Infinite is still the game that it is, even as the team there are trying to make it more palatable with, like Season 5, changing up how the armor cores work, basically more freed up customization, and actually with Forge, some really cool stuff that I may even do a video on fairly soon. Point is though, Microsoft do not seem to be extremely hands-on with their studios. You could say there is potentially something that could change that though, and that is the whole situation with Redfall, where per what Spencer said, following the disastrous launch of that game, basically they did not really seem to be properly up to date with what was going on in Redfall. It seemed that situation kind of surprised Xbox themselves based on their own mock review process, so I imagine some lessons will actually be learned from that. Obviously, Redfall was a pretty massive loss for them to take, didn't exactly tee them up nicely for what would be going on for the rest of the year. They obviously don't want that to happen again. What can be changed? That is actually what's interesting, because Redfall was changed. It seemingly had its live service elements be very massively downplayed. To look at Grounded, right, that being a survival early access game that hasn't asked for any money from players, that's been developed almost entirely under Microsoft. Maybe then you could look at, say, the Untitled survival game from Blizzard Entertainment. Maybe it will have a different approach, right? So that does mean that in progress plans, some new projects, those could actually be tweaked and changed. That, I think, is where we actually could have some decently exciting stuff go on. But again, most of what Phil was talking about here in the very, very sort of positive, exciting way, that wasn't the legacy franchises, which is actually pretty cool because a lot of those legacy franchises are great. Here's some other stuff Phil said. I think we've done an okay job at Xbox. I don't think we've done an A+ job on looking at our franchises and revisiting them. It's always a trade-off between what you do that's new and going back and doing something. I do think with Game Pass we have the ability to pick a couple of franchises every year and almost do like a revisited. Of course, reading a transcript from a podcast can be a bit awkward, but I think you get his point there. The idea that Game Pass essentially exists as a bucket that you can put content in, and there's a certain type of content that really would work quite well for that. And there's fairly good recent examples there with, say, the Quake 2 remaster, which you can go and play in Game Pass right now. And what's fun there is that he personally says Zork and Sierra Quest are key ones for him, but he also did shout out StarCraft, which, yes, would absolutely make me happy. So then, legacy IP stuff, really good. Projects that are already out being changed massively? Probably not, but you could expect a slower integration with some of those really big live services. For future projects though, the stuff that's getting greenlit, those big future roadmaps, that's where we could see some things change. Ultimately, the people who will be paying the bills, well, that's Microsoft, right? Microsoft will be bankrolling all of this. This does mean that the greenlighting process will be done by a different group of people at that very big corporate level than previous. A group who are a first-party platform that will have a different set of incentives to what Bobby and his board would have had, of course, at Activision-Blizzard pre-merger. All of that then could be quite decent. So, will the grass be greener? That one is kind of tricky to say. Look, at the end of the day, there's this idea called price anchoring, right? It's the idea that, you kind of want to set the bounds, sort of set the, the kind of region in which somebody is thinking about a price. So, if you wanted to sell something to somebody for like $80, you might start by saying, oh, $100, $120, because immediately then that has them psychologically thinking, oh, that's a pretty high ticket item. If I can get this down from $100 to $80, I'm going to get a deal and I'll feel good, right? It's just one of the many tactics that are out there. The point basically is, though, they have got people to accept some things when it comes to the monetization of games. The people who have just acquired this asset, acquired this cash, this revenue-generating business, they're not going to go in, look at all of this and say, fantastic, well, we're going to strip all of that out. Because at the end of the day, some of it does seem to actually work. Now, if you take a look at some of the Microsoft projects, I mean, hey, they're the people who tried to turn Halo into a free-to-play shooter. And for them, the problem with Halo Infinite was not that it was full of battle passes. The problem was that the battle pass was poorly designed. The progression wasn't fun. So it was less that Halo Infinite killed itself by being a live service, and it was far more, I think, for them, if they were doing their own post-mortem, that the live service was poorly executed. Because remember, at the launch of Halo Infinite, you had a lot of players basically saying, this battle pass isn't fun, these rewards aren't great. So I think quite naturally a group like Microsoft will then be thinking, oh, okay, the problem is we did not execute that well. They probably then look at Overwatch 2 with a season every 9 weeks and all of the cosmetics that they've got. They look at Call of Duty with its brisk seasons and insane quantity of cosmetic bundles, and the same for all the other Blizzard titles. And they probably think, actually, they've really got this monetization thing cracked. They have got games as a service cracked. That is indeed one of the things that they will have acquired them for. That, and of course, mobile, because yes, while the likes of Warcraft, Rumble, mostly Diablo Immortal, or Call of Duty Mobile, while those are fairly good, the big thing Microsoft will have wanted is King. King's IP, King's games, King's market intelligence, King's databases, King's ability to really optimize those customer acquisition costs to make this just finely tuned money-making machine. That's the kind of thing that is just of a tremendous value to a group like Microsoft. And even in some of the chatter around like the regulatory fun that they've had for the last while, they've really been playing up King as being like the reason why they really want to do this acquisition. Now, maybe that's because PlayStation tried to play their hand really hard with Call of Duty, which then would have positioned Microsoft as kind of wanting to downplay Call of Duty and focus a lot more on mobile. You could say some of that is just, playing a bit of chicken. Maybe that's just the, the sort of tactics of getting that kind of thing through. But ultimately, all these companies are there to make money, right? And as much as, say, with Starfield not being in PlayStation, as much as that will cost them a lot of money, they do actually want these for the money. The platform business is a fairly expensive one, You sell people consoles at a loss, you make all this infrastructure at a loss just to get people to then buy a game that is on your store, so you get a cut of that store. One of the things that they will want is just that World of Warcraft brings in a shit ton of money, and that's really good for them. Of course, with Game Pass Ultimate, perhaps, yes, they could throw something in with the Warcraft subscription, maybe the Elder Scrolls Online subscription. They could try to make some plays there. It is curious, though, that with ESO, thus far they haven't, and that does kind of tell us just, a little bit of that more hands-off kind of way they've got of doing things. On the topic of integration, actually, Phil Spencer has said that there are areas where he wanted them being Bethesda, to go faster or slower, but there were extenuating factors with the pandemic, so basically there is no full playbook. I think that kind of means that now that they are past the chaos of the console launch, past pandemic and everything, they're probably going to be working on their real big strategy as we move forward, right, for the next decade, especially into the next console cycle. Ultimately, Microsoft has a massive amount of money, a humongous amount of assets. You just look at how many studios they have. I think in the long run, they're seriously competitive with Sony. Sony, in one way, just get to ride off the success of the PS4, but also are currently competing marvelously well, right? Marvelously well on making those big AAA blockbuster games. One Ones, of course, that we have praised, like, say, Spider-Man 2, which is an absolute just, like, the rating for that game is just buy it out of 10. It seems to be actually that good and delivering everything that you would want. They're absolutely nailing it there. But you will note, as you actually think about Sony, the big sort of business model thing, we know that under the sort of later stage of Jim Ryan's leadership, they were really trying to push for the big live service titles. I think they were called Deviation Games. It was a bunch of ex-Treyarch staff. Basically, that ended up, from what we understand, being a big burner of money that obviously led nowhere. We've got The Last of Us Part 2 multiplayer live service game that essentially seems to have been like rebooted or downscaled. Obviously, Bungie were kind of brought in as these like live service experts to help get the entire group's ambitions going. Bungie have not exactly had the nicest time, these days with Destiny 2. So yes, it's all to say that right now the market is really defined on Sony's terms. Sony are winning it on those terms, right? It's like if you try to fight Sony on Sony's own territory, they're just going to slap you silly. However, look at the sheer number of users Microsoft will have from these Bethesda games. Then look at just the sheer MAUs, the sheer revenue that they will be getting from Activision-Blizzard King. Yes, the console market, they're not doing amazing in. In a way, though, they're actually doing pretty fantastic elsewhere. What else then? Well, obviously, one of the things that we're pretty concerned about as people who, follow these companies is the state of things, like in the workplace, right? Are staff getting a pretty shit deal? Because at the end of the day, good games are often not made by staff who are just ground into dust. We don't need any more Anthems or Mass Effect Andromedas or, launch Battlefield 2042s. Well, Bethesda staff and Undead Labs staff were both able to leak to Kotaku that there were problems at those studios before the transition, and that rather than kind of sweep in and, say, hey, we're the new management, we're going to fix this. No, Microsoft rather just expected them to clean up their own houses. One said that Microsoft's emphasis is on a hands-off culture towards these studios, which meant that the new owners just trusted Bethesda to take care of its own problems. As one former developer put it, we were afraid they would come in and change our, that's Undead Labs' culture, but our collapse came from within, and we could have used Microsoft's help. Now, these are several years old. These sort of counts. Since then, there's been quite a lot of, there's been problems. There's been the likes of Redfall, which I think was a real wake-up call for them, as, you could say that Halo Infinite probably has been as well. You then have how they're picking up Activision-Blizzard very much with humongous industry-wide, public-wide understanding of real workplace problems. That perhaps leads me to think then Microsoft will take that a little bit more seriously, because at the end of the day, they've probably realized that they cannot afford to have more Redfalls happen. And there are at least some positive things. As an example, a lot of what they had to agree to get this deal over the line is fairly decent for the industry, and also there is the CWA Microsoft agreement on workplace organization neutrality. This is something that will be a genuine confidence boost to staff who, kind of want to stand together, get some of that collective bargaining going. We talked about, say, at Raven Software, how there was some union busting going on. Well, Microsoft have, kind of signed this stuff with the CWA. So for a lot of those employees who maybe don't want to take shit anymore, if they happen to be taking shit right now, this will probably be a better banner for them to be under. And I do get the feeling that there's a fairly decent vibe around some of those staff. As for me personally, I don't think there'll be massive changes right now. I think the changes will be more felt in a longer time span. And the reason for that is the greenlighting of new projects, which naturally being AAA, you're probably looking at, a few years pre-production, few years production, because just the way that it is right now is that video games take a long ass time to develop. Though, the point of this video is, right, to make sure that your expectations are reasonable, that you are not misled, that you are not disappointed. Ultimately, if you thought there would be less monetization in the games that you play, that a lot of these things would change, and specifically change as a result of this merger, no. There so far is nothing said that would actually indicate that. Looking at some of the buzz, some of the discussions I've seen online, you would almost think that Phil Spencer said that Blizzard were going a bit too hard on monetization. No, Phil Spencer has not said that. That being said, as a last little positive bit of news, and maybe I'll dive into in a little bit more detail somewhere else, in early 2024, the Overwatch team is going to be reevaluating their battle pass and they'll have plans to share. Do I think that is spurred on by Microsoft? No, absolutely not. I think that is spurred on by them genuinely having problems in the operation of their game. I think their battle pass stuff is probably not performing anywhere near as well as they expected to, and they know that some change needs to happen. I mean, come on, they've just lost the public confidence like all the time. And they might also kind of seethe and say, hey, look how much they charge for a gun skin in Valorant. We're not doing anything quite that ridiculous. But ultimately, you're Blizzard. You anchored people in big, premium, a la carte experience games. You were very successful when you did that. You were very, very successful. That's kind of the bed that you made. You were very successful in that bed. But changing consumer perceptions after the fact, yeah, good luck. So that's it for today. That's really everything you've got to know as this merger actually gets completed, and we can sort of talk about what happens next. Hope you found this to be a interesting little dive into the topic. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.